I will now welcome Dr. Patrice Lindsay, Director of System Change in the Stroke Program here at Heart and Stroke.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you everybody for joining us. We are extremely fortunate today to be presenting this webinar on vaping to all of you. We'd like to have a special welcome to so many of you. This is a record for us. It's a record registration at any of our webinars. We had over 1,400 people register for this webinar. Today's discussion is very timely. It's very all over the media right now, and being talked about in governments and regions and families. We're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Andrew Pipe, who also happens to be our board chair at Heart and Stroke, but is also a world-leading expert on new approaches to smoking cessation, vaping, and strategies really designed to facilitate exercise adoption and prevention in cardiovascular disease. Because so much of the focus around vaping has been talking about our youth around the world, we thought it would be really important to understand the youth perspective as we listen to Dr. Pipe and go into this discussion about where we're at with vaping and cardiovascular disease. So also with us today is Max. Max is an 18-year-old individual who is also a vapor, and we're going to hear from him today and start our discussion by understanding from the perspective of today's youth what they're talking about and what their perspectives on vaping are. So we're going to start there, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Pipe. So Max, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Why don't we start off with a couple simple questions? Max, you know, our perception is that all of a sudden all of our youth are vaping. How common is vaping among your friends and your peers? And, you know, is it more common than cigarettes, or what's happening?
So yeah, it's definitely an issue nowadays. Almost everyone I know is vaping. Cigarettes haven't really been a part of this culture nowadays, kind of moving forward into vaping, and I'd say the minorities of people who don't vape.
Today's news talked about the influence of social media on the vaping issue, saying that for every one tweet about, you know, the concerns around vaping, there's 10,000 pro-vaping tweets going on. From your perspective, is social media really that big an influence on what's happening?
No, I don't think so. I think that people who are vaping youth, we're obviously on social media, but I think we take more notice to the negative stories about it and not so much the positives. We all know it's not a good thing, and we see that through the stories that have been coming through in the media recently. So I personally don't think that the social media is a factor in getting people vaping.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think the perception out there is quite different. So if it's not social media influence, what discussions are happening about vaping? Like, what are the things you and your friends are talking about related to vaping and, you know, reactions to all of the media and other messaging out there?
There's been a lot of people I know, including myself, that have tried cutting back and tried quitting because of all this news. Obviously, we're all young, we're all teenagers. We're in good health now, but I think if we continue along our path, it's going to change. So I think that the media has done a good job of putting forward ideas and stories that will affect how we think about the situation.
Excellent. And then just to wrap up, what don't parents know? Like, what do you think parents need to be more aware of, or what don't they know about what's happening? And how can, you know, parents and others in the healthcare field be more sensitive and, you know, more useful to you as you're starting to think of these things and struggle with, you know, cutting down on vaping?
I think, well, a lot of adults now have grown up in the age of cigarettes, so they understand the whole smoking habit and smoking addiction. But I think that vaping is a lot more accessible, as you don't have to go outside to do it. It doesn't have an awful smell to it. So it's a lot more accessible for us to be able to use it indoors, outdoors. So it turns into like this really bad habit. It's kind of like just a vicious cycle of repetition.
It's really important. Thank you. Are there any other comments you'd like to make, Max, before we turn it over to Dr. Pipe?
I think I've said my my dues. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic, and we really greatly appreciate you being part of this today. So, Dr. Pipe, I'd like to turn it over to you now, and you should be able to advance your slides now.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And first, let me thank Max for sharing his perspectives. It's very gracious of him to join us this afternoon, and he provides a very important context to the discussion that follows. I'd like to respond to some of the observations that Max made, and will do so in the course of our conversation this afternoon. It is important, and unfortunately, it is important to note that that one can always have technology problems, in as much that I do not seem to be able to advance my slides. There we go. Something is happening. Now we've gone ahead about 3. Can we go back? Now we've gone ahead 4. Can we go back? Thank you. It's very important to contextualize this discussion today, that I identify to you that I've had these kinds of relationships in the past, in order that you can assess the objectivity that I bring to our discussion today. I'm going to hope that the organizers of today's conference will shut the webcam down, so that you can look at the slides rather than having to look at a decaying, decrepit old clinician as we move forward in this presentation. There's just no question that of all of the things that we can do in virtually any clinical environment, there is nothing that is more important or more powerful than smoking cessation. And that is particularly true in the cardiovascular world. There's just no question that of all of the risk factors we can address for those with cardiovascular disease or at risk of cardiovascular disease, smoking cessation is simply the most important intervention that we can deliver. And I apologize, there seems to be some time lag, as there is with most communications to Toronto, in terms of making these slides move forward. It's important to understand that smokers lose at least a decade of life expectancy when compared to non-smokers. The very good news is that individuals who stop smoking before they reach the age of 40 reduce their risk of death associated with continued smoking by about 90%. I also want to characterize some of my comments today as identifying the zombies of smoking cessation, these concepts that live on, that are very difficult to kill off, and they represent a unique mixture of prejudice, misinformation, dogma, and sometimes unrealistic professional certainty. And one of the most important zombies to address is that smoking is a habit. And you may notice that Max used the word habit several times during his discussion. I would hope that as a consequence of our conversation today, that you would commit never, ever again to use the word habit in any conversation in which the word smoking or vaping appears, because to do so would immediately reveal you do not understand the fundamental mechanisms which are at play and which impel and maintain smoking or vaping behavior. If you look at this list of substances, you find that the likelihood of becoming addicted to a substance after only one exposure is highest for tobacco, more essentially nicotine, than for all of these other happy compounds that cause so much problem in our community. Nicotine is a tenaciously addictive. Smokers, and as we will see, vapors, use very sophisticated drug delivery devices. And clinicians very often give little thought to the design or the principles or precepts which underlie these particular devices. We could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about the features of a cigarette, which are there precisely to ensure that people's addictive needs for nicotine are sated very rapidly, and that they are able to self-administer and precisely titrate their nicotine intake. We won't go into many of the features of cigarettes. Let me just make one quick point. The filters do absolutely nothing. They do not reduce risk. They just deceive the public into thinking that somehow their risk is being mitigated or minimized. The first cigarette filters were made from asbestos. There was a particularly inspired decision. And while we get very, very concerned about intravenous drug use in the community, we often overlook the fact, until we reflect upon it, that when you vape or when you smoke, you're an intra-arterial drug user, because the products of smoking or vaping are taken via the pulmonary circulation to the heart, to the left ventricle, and very, very rapidly disseminated throughout the body, influencing every organ system and every tissue. And of course, nicotine, the addictive agent of concern, is delivered very rapidly to the brainstem where it attaches to receptors, which depolarize the neurons to which they're attached. And that in itself then ignites a cascade of neurological activity, culminating in the release of large quantities of dopamine in the forebrain. And simply put, the desire of a smoker or a vapor to use their device comes as a consequence of the emerging discomfort that occurs in the presence of falling levels of nicotine receptor stimulation and falling levels of dopamine. And dopamine is the quintessential ubiquitous pleasure neurotransmitter. So with that as background, it's also important to understand that all smokers smoke to maintain a certain constant level of nicotine. And as their mixed venous levels of nicotine fall to this level, that's when the feeling that, boy, I need another cigarette or I need an opportunity to vape comes in. One other thing that's important to understand here is that cigarette smokers smoke the cigarette and they may then take 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, 35 minutes, 20, but smoking punctuates their day. Vapors, in contrast, tend to be continuously vaping throughout the day. And when a cigarette is ignited and burns, smoke and nicotine go off into the air, into the atmosphere. When a vapor vapes, all of the products produced by that device go into the lungs. So there's a much greater concentration of these products. And as we will see in a few minutes, there's a far greater concentration of nicotine. Now, we use nicotine to help individuals stop smoking, recognizing that we can deliver nicotine and hopefully come close to that comfort zone identified in that previous slide. And when doing that, that then allows a would-be non-smoker to go about their day acquiring a whole new repertoire of non-smoking behaviors free of the discomfort of cravings or withdrawal. And let me say at the outset that when the concept of e-devices, vaping devices emerged, many of us saw an opportunity to use these devices in smoking cessation and as a means of harm reduction. More of that to come in the moments that follow. It's also important to recognize that we have a variety of agents that can help people stop smoking. And I just very quickly want to draw your attention to the fact that the most effective medication for smoking cessation is in fact a combination of a nicotine patch plus a more rapid form of nicotine delivery, such as the lozenge, the gum, or the little nicotine vaporizer. And it's also important to understand that the patch alone virtually doubles the likelihood of successful smoking cessation, whereas the use of nicotine in combination, that is a slow form with a more rapid form used during the day when that is necessary, almost quadruples the likelihood of successful smoking cessation. And I want you to pay careful attention to these figures. So the use of the patch produces in most studies about a 23-24% cessation rate. The patch in combination, a 36-37% cessation rate, but in some studies it's been as high as 45%. Remember those figures. Now let's get on to talking about vaping, the subject of interest today. And I first want to show you this slide, which I prepared some 7 or 8 years ago, and tried to identify at that point some of the considerations that should inform and influence the way we use these devices, and hopefully, the way we might have regulated those devices. First, it's important to recognize that yes, in terms of reducing the risk of cancer, inhaling nicotine produced as a result of the vaporization of a solution containing nicotine is infinitely safer than inhaling nicotine produced by combustion of tobacco products. It's the combustion of tobacco products that cause the creation of the carcinogenic agents, which are responsible for lung cancer and all of the other many varied varieties of cancer that are associated and distinctly related to tobacco addiction. So there is a potential harm reduction capacity of these devices. Will these devices be able to help individuals stop smoking? Well, by far the greatest body of evidence points out that most adult smokers, By the way, vaping is almost exclusively a teenage and young adult phenomenon. But most adult smokers who may use these in an attempt to stop smoking become what we call JUUL users. They smoke conventional cigarettes at certain times of the day. They use these devices at other times of the day. There is no harm reduction. And what is also quite clear is that the likelihood of them stopping smoking actually is reduced. So there's a particular clinical conundrum. We also recognize that nicotine, being as addictive as it is, had the capacity to induce a whole new generation of nicotine addicts. If the tobacco industry, and by the way, the vaping industry is basically the tobacco industry in drag, no pun intended, but used all of the sophisticated social media advertising components at its availability, that we would probably see a dramatic increase in smoking amongst teenagers and adolescents. And I want to draw attention to something else that Max said. Whenever anyone is asked about whether advertising influences them, their answer is no. And that was true of teenagers 20 or 30 years ago when the tobacco advertising was aimed at your average 13-year-old. Everyone, adults, teenagers, all deny that advertising has any influence on us at all. But what advertising does is it provides a very extensive social backdrop of this is normal behavior. This is what's going on. And so we can all say, gee, it doesn't really influence me. It didn't make me immediately get from my chair and go and purchase product X or Y. But it cements my understanding that this is somehow a normal kind of behavior. And of course, the degree to which the tobacco industry has become involved in the vaping industry means that we are now exposed to the reptilian stealth, the deceitful, deceptive practices, the aggressive lobbying to prevent any form of regulation of these devices. So let's move on and examine these phenomena a little bit more carefully. All of these products contain three simple parts: a mouthpiece, which when sucked upon may trigger an on-off switch which turns on a heating element which heats the solution contained within that device, and that solution contains a very, very addictive substance, nicotine. Now, the industry has evolved quite dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. And that slide I showed you a few moments ago represented what we would term a ciga-like, a device that looks like a cigarette. Indeed, many of them glowed red when you sucked on it to imitate or duplicate a cigarette's look and function. But the products have changed dramatically, both in terms of appealing to fashion and particularly to making these look cool, look sophisticated. Once again, all of this advertising is aimed principally at teenagers, and also changes in technology, because we are now looking at 4th generation e-devices, and let's talk a little bit more about how they've evolved. So there's that ciga-like, looks like a cigarette, very simple. Then we began to see the 2nd generation products, which contain cartridges which could be filled or purchased, like a fountain pen cartridge, for instance. I really date myself when I make that analogy, I recognize. And then the 3rd generation represented products in which not only could the solution be modified or created by oneself, and therefore you can increase the concentration of products, you can make a virtual vaping cocktail, if you will, purchasing solutions from vape shops, but you could also influence the heat at which this solution is heated, the temperature, pardon me, by increasing the strength of the battery, the voltage, et cetera, et cetera. And so these kind of devices have become known as mods. Also important to know that particularly amongst teenagers, there tend to be 2 kinds of vapors. There are flavor chasers. These are individuals that really like trying different flavors, and it's the flavors which are very appealing. And then there are those who, notwithstanding the attractiveness of various flavors, want to produce voluminous amounts of vape. And so these are what we call vapor chasers. And this allows teenagers and young adults to do sort of little stunts with vaping. They can blow vape between their teeth, out their nose, if they've got a perforated eardrum, out their ear canal, and go on YouTube, and you will be astonished at the sort of videos that are available in those kind of settings that talk about this. And then finally, we have the 4th generation, or pod mods. these devices, which we'll talk about in some detail, which contain a solution of nicotine which has been prepared in an entirely different way and which uses nicotine salts for reasons that are clear. Important to understand that the wick and the coil, the heating element, contain, as we'll see in a moment, ceramics, metallic products, etc., that add to the list of ingredients that are present in the liquid and which, of course, virtually automatically find themselves in the aerosol. And it's important to ask oneself, well, what are the implications of inhaling heated vapors that contain various combinations of these particular chemicals, and chemicals which may be created just by the fact of heating that solution? And when you add in the fact that there are thousands of flavor chemicals which are added to these devices in a totally unregulated way, you begin to understand that there are some pretty significant implications for vaping. And this slide just points out that that wick device, that heating and wick device, contains silica, not unlike asbestos in terms of the response it produces in the lungs, nickel, which is a known carcinogen and can reduce the immunological capacity of the lung, and chromium, also a carcinogen known to produce lung damage, etc., etc. And then, of course, finally comes the most sophisticated drug delivery device of all, JUUL, which emerged on the market just a few years ago, designed by two graduate students at Stanford University who initially claimed that they were designing this device in order to help people stop smoking. That kind of message has long disappeared from this corporation's language. Very sophisticated. The solution is contained in this in a pod, and the battery can be recharged using the USB charging kind of device. And because of the way in which the JUUL solution is prepared, it delivers an immense amount of nicotine. And so individuals consuming a single pod of these devices consume the equivalent amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And many teenagers are consuming 2, 3, 4, sometimes even more of these pods a day. So they are being exposed to a stupendous load of nicotine, all made possible by the fact that the mode of preparation of the nicotine means that an individual using this device can take far more nicotine than would be the case if they were a conventional smoker. Because if you increase the amount of nicotine in a conventional cigarette, it will have the impact of causing a great deal of discomfort and irritation in the area of the throat. That can be addressed somewhat by adding menthol to the cigarette, which acts, if you will, as a bit of a local anesthetic and allows nicotine content of cigarettes to be further increased, but nowhere near the level that can be achieved by using a nicotine salt, a product like JUUL. And of course, as a consequence of the fact that vapors seek nicotine and they want the most effective and the most rapid way to deliver it, what you see here is the way in which JUUL took off in a stratospheric kind of trajectory and now occupies a huge proportion of the market, a market which, by the way, is almost exclusively teenagers and young adults. So there's that cartridge. That cartridge also poses other problems. It's an electronic device which contains a pesticide. And so therefore, you have disposal issues with this particular device. We also have the challenge of the fact that the use of these devices is becoming commonplace in a variety of settings. And I'm sure that in your communities, as in mine, there have been great outbursts of angst and concern as a consequence of the fact that high schools are taking the doors off bathrooms. All of the USB charging devices are being taken out of classrooms because the use of these devices in the classroom, in the bathrooms, has become so commonplace that it is being completely disruptive of normal school life. And teenagers are coming home and saying, I can't go to the bathroom all day because the place is just full of a cloud of vapor. And so understandable concern emerging from parents, from high school principals, from others. These devices are being used in the locker rooms of teenage sport activities, between periods, et cetera, et cetera. So a very big challenge. And of course, another industry has emerged to address this or to respond to this. And so it's now possible to buy clothing which allows you to even more surreptitiously use a vaping device in the classroom or wherever. And you can just pick up what appears to be the drawstring of your hoodie and exhale through that drawstring, and nobody is the wiser. Well, a principal concern, of course, is that we know from animal models and human experience that nicotine is a gateway drug. And we also know that the teenage brain, and remind ourselves that ultimate brain development does not occur until about age 24 or 25. The teenage brain is particularly susceptible to becoming addicted to nicotine. And there is very good evidence from a variety of animal models that once you engender or create that neurological pathway, which is responsible for perpetuating addictive behavior, that architecture remains there. It's there, and so exposure to other drugs means that teenagers subsequently are much more likely to become addicted to other compounds later in life. Well, what's been happening in Canada insofar as youth vaping is concerned, and I think this slide speaks for itself. A very dramatic increase in vaping behavior, and Max's comments this morning I think were very revealing, and that most of his contemporaries are vaping on a regular basis. And this is a phenomenon which is now occurring in the public school setting. But what's also happened is that we see that as rates of vaping have increased, whether one vapes in the last 30 days, whether one's vaped in the past 7 days, we also see that now for the first time in 30, 35 years, we have an increase in teenage smoking. And it's completely predictable that if you become addicted to nicotine through vaping, and vaping products might be somewhat expensive in certain settings, and therefore you need to have access to nicotine, it's relatively easy to get nicotine in other forms, particularly combustion products, and so we see a migration of vaping behavior into smoking behavior. And that's a great concern, and I'll present you some alarming statistics that reflect the implications of this kind of phenomenon. Why do Canadian youth vape? That answer is pretty clear, and it's true of teenagers as it is true of younger adults. I like the flavors and/or the smell, which is one of the reasons why the vaping industry is so resolutely opposed to any form of regulation, particularly as it relates to flavoring of these particular devices. The consequence of vaping, the more substantial, significant adverse consequences came home like a thunderbolt this last summer as a consequence of the identification of a whole variety of acute lung injuries and many subsequent deaths associated with vaping. The majority of these cases involved vaping tobacco products that had been cut, if you will, with vitamin E acetate. But it is important to recognize that approximately 20% of these cases are associated with nicotine-only vaping. Now, the exploration of the relationships continues to be undertaken by many authorities in the United States and elsewhere. But the implications of vaping obviously were brought home to the public very dramatically. So let's just talk very briefly about some of the consequences of vaping. Let's look at the effects of vaping liquid, no flavors, just a little bit of nicotine and the vaping liquid on lung function. Overall, lung function is declined. There are changes in the way in which the airways work, changes in which the way the lung is able to protect itself, and changes in the way in which the alveoli, the principal chamber in which air is exchanged with the circulation, function. So some very significant implications. We also know that so many of these flavored products were introduced into the marketplace either as ingredients of products that can be put on the skin. Let's talk about coconut oil in that respect, or to be ingested. Let's use coconut oil in that respect. And so these are referred to as GRAS, generally regarded as safe when applied to the skin or when eaten. But there have been no studies whatsoever about the safety of the thousands of chemicals which are now being inhaled into the lungs of vapors. And what we know about the nature of some of those chemicals means that undeniably there will be implications for the use of these chemicals in terms of lung function. And e-cigarettes contain a variety of toxicants. Propylene glycol is generally the vehicle that carries the nicotine. You and I know that in a sense as antifreeze. Vegetable glycerin is also found there. There's nicotine from tobacco, but there are flavoring agents. Let's talk about popcorn flavored vaping solution. We know that when you introduce popcorn flavoring, you can produce very significant lung implications. As noted earlier, there are issues associated with the heating coil. the wicks contain cotton and fabric fragments go into the lung, and that also is problematic. And at the same time, silica is present in these devices, and the implications of silica are very significant. Let me put this in context. In the 1930s, lung cancer was an exceptionally rare cancer. It took us 20 or 30 years before we understood the neoplastic implications of an epidemic of smoking behavior. Our colleagues in respiratory medicine and respiratory pathology are now talking about features in the lungs that they examine of vapors that are typical of things we call interstitial lung diseases and other forms of lung disease, which at the present time are rare. But it's not unreasonable to suspect that if we have induce addiction to nicotine and the use of these devices to a generation, that 20 or 30 years from now, we're going to see, a reduction of cancers, but we may see an epidemic of other forms of lung disease with exactly the same kind of implications. And respiratory diseases and respiratory deaths are not pleasant, and they are completely unnecessary when we can anticipate the likelihood of their occurrence as a consequence of the use of products like this. So what are those respiratory effects? Well, they're protean, and the authors of recently published studies point out that e-cigarettes will likely prove to have pulmonary toxicity with chronic and possibly even short-term use. And the authors of these kinds of studies talk about the importance of clinicians advocating for appropriate regulation, which includes banning the flavoring of these particular products. We also know that the immunological functions in the lung are completely suppressed, when exposed to vaping solutions. And there are characteristic changes associated with those acute lung injuries, which reflect the classic features of inflammatory lung disease, chemically induced lung disease, and are being seen these are being seen in the lungs of vapors. The first case in Canada was identified in London, Ontario, and just a few weeks ago, the circumstances of that case were described, in this article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which called for tighter regulation of these cigarettes. And the editorial in that particular issue also pointed out that the Canadian Medical Association Journal had for many years been talking about a ban on flavorings and restrictions on advertising, et cetera, and the editorialist made the point that he hoped it was not too late for Canada's governments to learn. So very clearly, evidence that vaping, while potentially substantially less harmful from smoking from a neoplastic perspective, still has very significant risks, and we don't want to wait 10 to 20 years before the data emerges to be able to, with complete confidence, summarize the implications of these devices. Well, we're a cardiovascular, cerebrovascular audience, so it's probably important that we understand that e-cigarettes participate in all of the same kind of mechanisms that ultimately lead to the development of atherosclerosis, thrombosis, and myocardial infarction, cerebral thrombosis or stroke, et cetera, And recently published studies show that all of the elements which we know to be associated with vascular, cerebrovascular, and cardiovascular disease are there. The use of e-cigarettes free of flavoring agents causes changes in vascular function, very distinct changes in vascular function, and changes, in the case of the e-cigarettes, which are not that much different from the changes produced by cigarette smoking. So we are not eliminating the hazards that are associated, insofar as the vascular system is concerned, when people are exposed to e-cigarettes. And as a consequence, the word is now going out that we need to be vigilant in monitoring the vascular health of adolescents and adult e-cigarette users. We also know in this study just published just a few days ago that the toxicity of the aerosols from JUUL and the previous generation of e-cigarettes, that it's not appropriate at all to talk about reduced risk when we're talking about these products, and specifically JUUL. When we do sophisticated imaging of the vascular structures, we find exactly the same kind of thing. Impaired microvascular functioning, stiffening of the blood vessels, a paralysis of the ability of blood vessels to dilate, et cetera, et cetera. And as well, and of particular interest to those of us concerned about stroke, we know that the use of e-cigarettes, even in the short term, now makes platelets much more likely to stick together and clots much more likely to form. So in the face of altered cardiovascular reactivity from a vascular point of view and increased thrombogenicity, we recognize that this is a particularly significant cocktail in terms of cardiovascular and cerebrovascular issues. Well, are these agents able to help people stop smoking? This particular publication, published 2 years ago, suggests that there's only limited evidence. Now, to be fair, this publication came before the publication of a significant study I'm going to show you about in a moment. So not a great deal of evidence in that respect. And at a conference we held in Ottawa just this past weekend, we invited two of the more, I would say, the most prominent individuals in this whole area, Dr. Hayden McRobbie from New Zealand and the United Kingdom, who was the senior author of this publication in the New England Journal, which showed that e-cigarettes in a clinical setting can be helpful for smoking cessation, and Dr. Stan Glantz from the University of California in San Francisco, who has been a consistent critic from the results of his research of the e-cigarette industry and calling for appropriate regulation. So here's Dr. McRobbie's study. And in this classic study, individuals in the United Kingdom were provided with either e-cigarettes or conventional nicotine replacement therapy. Let me cut to the chase. At the end of the study, 18% of those using e-cigarettes had stopped smoking, whereas only about 10% of those using nicotine replacement had stopped smoking. Important to recognize that when we look back at those slides I showed you a moment or so ago, that the use of combination nicotine therapy can produce cessation rates of 35, 34%, and in some studies, 45%, and certainly much higher than the 9 or 10% noted here or the 18% noted in this particular subgroup of those subjects. We also, if we note what happens 6 months and 12 months after the study, that almost 40% of those using the e-cigarettes are still using the e-cigarettes, whereas only a small fraction of those who are using nicotine replacement are using nicotine replacement products. And that has implications because we know that the perpetuation of e-cigarette use beyond 10 or 12 months cements the likelihood that individuals are going to go back to smoking. Now, very important to understand this study and to place it in context. As noted in my opening remarks, I believe in the potential for these devices to be able to be of assistance with smoking cessation, certainly in clinical settings. But in order for us to be able to use those products intelligently, responsibly, and consistent with professional standards, we need to know what's in those products. And we need to ensure that those products themselves do not contain substances which could be potentially very, very harmful. And so when looking at this particular study, it's important to understand that all of the participants in this study were participating in a clinical trial in which they got counseling. They are not typical individuals who are vapors and who may decide they're going to go down to the local shop and pick up something in an attempt to stop smoking. Because we know that we can induce smoking cessation in those in clinical trials at a rate very different from that amongst the general public. And in fact, when you look at this next data, you see that if we examine those studies which were undertaken within the general public, individuals who decide they're going to give these things a chance in order to be able to help them stop smoking, let's call that the real world context, that the likelihood of smoking cessation is in fact reduced, as revealed by the fact that this line is to the left of this particular vertical line here. And this forest plot is a classic way of determining whether there is an advantage or whether there isn't an advantage. Now, the study that I've just showed you is not included in this clinical trial group, but we see that there are 3 clinical trials there which do show an advantage. And certainly the Hayek-McRobbie trial will be added to this group and clearly shows evidence that these devices can be helpful in clinical settings, which is all the more reason why we want to make sure that these are products that can be used appropriately in those clinical settings. What's happening, however, is that many adults embark upon vaping, sometimes just out of curiosity and want to become a vapor, which is the case of the author of this article, which appeared in The Guardian a few weeks ago, but who point out that what they are facing now is an epidemic of addiction because they suddenly recognize they're powerless to to deal with their addiction to these devices. And JUUL is a particularly vicious device in this particular setting. And ironically, what is happening is this. Individuals addicted to e-devices are actually moving to cigarettes because they rationalize, and it is probably the case, that's an opinion, not grounded in fact, it is probably the case that it is easier to quit smoking cigarettes than it is to quit JUULing. And this is a phenomenon which we're now seeing across North America, particularly among teenagers. This is being reported increasingly to be the case. And so it's very important when we think about the potential of these devices to help people stop smoking or to reduce harm, to consider the implications of the fact that they have created a new generation of nicotine addicts. And the authors of this article, which was published almost 2 years ago now, did some very elegant statistical analyses and said that basically for every smoker that quits using these devices, 80 kids become addicted to nicotine. They also pointed out that they were using the most optimistic data in terms of assessing the likelihood of cessation using these devices, so that the consequences are potentially worse. And the other important point to note here is that this data and the studies which were analyzed preceded the real impact of JUUL, which had only recently come to the market at that particular point. So there's a very rapidly evolving perspective. And it's revealed in statements like the Council of the Chief Medical Officers of Health on the left, and the words of Adrian Dix, the British Columbia Minister of Health in last November. Because the reality is that in Canada today, these products are virtually unregulated. And as a consequence of the federal government's neglect, their indifference, and their inertia, we are now faced with an epidemic of addiction, and we are now faced with potential epidemics of other vaping-related diseases, which it is reasonable to expect will develop unless these products can be appropriately regulated. This graphic was produced by Physicians for a Smoke-Free Canada, and it lists an array of regulations which could be applied to these products. It also identifies where those regulations are to be found. And as we'll see, the regulations from the federal government are pretty minimal, but they're there. But provinces, particularly British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, are moving to fill that regulatory gap. And congratulations to the politicians in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and to the Minister of Health in British Columbia, because they're now demonstrating distinct leadership in response to what is clearly a very important public health issue. And it is to be hoped that our federal government, in order to avoid a patchwork quilt of varying provincial regulations, will bring in some robust, thoughtful, and forceful regulations. Here's a classic example. JUUL in Canada contains 66 milligrams of nicotine or more, much less in JUUL in the United Kingdom. These products have been banned in many countries, but so there's no meaningful regulation at present relating to the nicotine content or the presence of flavors. That is until Ministers of Health in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, became involved, and the Minister of Health in British Columbia began to develop some important regulations. How did we arrive at this point? You know, there's a standard public health principle that we call the precautionary principle, which says that if we have reasonable evidence to infer or imply that the contents of a particular product may cause harm, well, you know, something in a product that might be used as a dish soap has been found to create psoriasis in 2% of the users, that product is never going to see the light of day, because it's just a very smart thing to prevent those kinds of issues from ever occurring. And that's been a standard public health practice. On the other hand, another very important concept is one of harm reduction. And I'm a believer in harm reduction. We know, for instance, that we can dramatically mitigate the effects of opioid addiction by the use of substances like methadone, Suboxone, in order to dramatically reduce the risk and allow people to begin to acquire a whole new, much healthier kind of lifestyle. And so harm reduction makes sense. But one should apply the precautionary principle to the harm reduction approach. while I believe in the utility of methadone and Suboxone, I'm not suggesting it should be sold in convenience stores all across the country in a variety of attractive flavors: chocolate, bubblegum, candy bear, mixed fruit, etc., etc. And that analogy is perhaps a little strident, but I think it makes the point. And unfortunately, I think it is the case that many of those in Health Canada who, despite the advice they were given for health organizations some years ago about the need to regulate these products, succumbed to the siren song of harm reduction and the messages of many, particularly from the vaping industry and now most recently from the tobacco industry, that, oh, we shouldn't do anything which should impair or impede the availability or the accessibility of smokers to these products because we want them to migrate to the use of these products. A very optimistic perspective, one which has now been, I think, replaced with a realistic understanding of what has happened as a result of the lack of regulation of these particular products. So there are very real challenges which the Heart and Stroke Foundation is responding to in terms of its activities, its advocacy. You can understand and appreciate these particular challenges, and there is a need to push the reset button to ensure that we get public policy which is thoughtful, which is organized, which reflects the burgeoning, emerging literature about the health consequences of these products, and reins in an industry which is using all of the tools and tricks of the tobacco industry, because essentially it is the tobacco industry. And I would suggest to you that the vape shops that are present in your community are soon going to be gone, because JUUL and big tobacco and other tobacco companies are going to completely dominate this market. And so the agitated lobbying of the vaping industry at present against any form of regulation is in fact, they are messages of self-interest predicated upon their recognition of their survival. Well, it's always very nice in making presentations like this to be able to cite articles that come from the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's particularly nice to be able to cite articles which appeared just a day or two. It gives the appearance that you're really on top of this particular topic, and I hope that that is the case. But this is an article that appeared in the New England Journal just a couple of days ago, and points out, as we have heard from so many sources, the need to regulate these products with all of the mechanisms that we know have been effective in addressing tobacco issues in the past, in particular flavor restrictions, et cetera, given the fact that we are seeing, this is US data, but the data is actually the same in Canada, this explosion of vaping device amongst the use of vaping devices amongst high school students, as reflected in the insightful comments that Max made at the beginning of our presentation today. And also 2 or 3 days ago, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, responsible for the investigation of the relationships between vaping and lung disease, quite clearly said they wish to recommend that the best way to address these risks is to refrain from the use of all e-cigarettes or vaping products. There are no ambiguities in these kinds of statements. It's also the case that we know that the general public is highly supportive of the government applying the same kind of restrictions and regulations to vaping products as are applied to tobacco products. In March last year, every province and territory called on the federal government to align the restrictions to make them consistent across the country on the display, advertising, and promotion of these products, as well as many other regulatory messages. Rudolf Virchow, the great German pathologist, once pointed out that there are 2 causes of disease. One is pathological, the other is political. And so in the context of today's discussion, the absence of policy, an absence of policy which depends upon the action of politicians, reveals that we are now on the verge of a whole new wave of diseases, the cause of which not only is pathological, but also a consequence of what I would indicate is political neglect. Finally, a zombie concept, perhaps of a different kind. The idea that the tobacco issue has been addressed is a zombie concept. It's difficult to kill off. It's important to recognize that while the percentage of Canadians who are smokers has fallen, the population has increased over the years, and still 47,000 Canadians a year pay for their tobacco addiction with their lives at a time when the profits of the tobacco industry have never, ever been greater. And at a time when the tobacco industry is now deviously ingenious in terms of supporting the introduction of a whole new range of products, which will addict a whole new generation of customers to replace those of their former customers who died prematurely directly as a result of consumption of their products. So smoking cessation, vaping cessation will continue to be the single most powerful preventive interventions we can deliver in clinical practice. And we are at a point of inflection at the moment. We have an opportunity to intervene through thoughtful public policy and through ensuring that we allow these products to be regulated appropriately in order that they are not used indiscriminately, and yes, indeed, in order that they might sensibly then be used by clinicians as appropriate, with appropriate evidence, to help individuals deal with their nicotine addiction. With that, I want to stop, but I want to stop by, as I do that, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know that sometimes there can be nothing more numbing than listening to a voice from Ottawa drone over your computer or your speaker. I'm very grateful to you for participating in this session. I also want to thank Max, who represents a very important element of this issue and whose perspectives he so generously and so graciously shared. I'd be delighted in the moments that remain to respond to any questions, comments, or criticisms. And my final concluding remarks are to utter the 11 words despised and loathed by Canadians from coast to coast to coast. I'm from Ottawa, and I'm here to help you. If at any time I can be of assistance to any of you, please don't hesitate to contact me. It would be a delight to be of assistance. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was a fantastic talk. You had a huge audience and not one person dropped off during the entire conversation. So I really appreciate that. We have had many questions, some for you and some for Max. So I will start off with a couple for you. Andrew, the first one is vaping and e-cigarettes have been around for a while now. Why are we only just starting to see the lung illnesses and understanding the cardiovascular risk now when it's, you know, is it just because it took that long for the disease to manifest?
Well, thank you. An excellent question. I think, very simply put, it's taken that long for people to get their ducks in a row in order to be able to look at these phenomena and to perform the appropriate studies. And clearly, the events of the last year are going to fuel a very substantial increase in research in this area. And I think that's a very understandable reason. And of course, the other thing is that the nature of the products has evolved dramatically over the course of that decade. And so the uptake of the initial products was not great. And so there was perhaps not the kind of concern that exists now that there's been an explosion of use and an explosion in the use of very, very sophisticated devices which deliver astronomical levels of nicotine.
Thanks. And now Max has a question for you.
How long would you say it takes to do like irreparable damage to your lungs if you're a daily user, or even if you just use it casually?
It's a very good question. It's a great question, Max, and the answer is going to be unsatisfactory because the answer is I don't know, and that reflects the fact that we've got such limited experience in terms of understanding the implications of the use of these devices, and now curiosity is beginning to emerge. It's beginning to explode amongst clinicians. So, for instance, while the acute lung injuries have attracted considerable attention, my respirology colleagues tell me that, gee, they're now starting to see increased attendance in emergency rooms of individual vapors who are now complaining not of acute lung injuries, but they've got sort of more common respiratory kind of conditions, and they're coming back far more frequently as a result of that. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, but it's going to require scrutiny and the recognition that we now have to ask people about the use of these devices. Most clinicians probably still don't, most clinicians aren't all that great in asking about conventional tobacco product use. And certainly it's only now that people are beginning to ask about vaping. And a series of questions are going to be required. you're vaping? Yes. What are you vaping? What kind of device do you use? How often do you use it, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these are going to allow us to develop the kind of knowledge that you would expect of us, and which underlies your question.
Thank you. I'm now going to direct a question to Max. You know, when you talked about how all of your friends are doing it or vaping, would you feel socially isolated or left out of your peer group if you either did not start vaping or if you stopped among a group that didn't?
Oh, absolutely. I've had friends who have stopped, like 1 out of 10, and they definitely feel isolated because everyone around them is doing it now, and it's just, and they don't actually hang out with us quite a lot less now, just because they can't deal with it. But we're all trying to quit now, so I'm trying to join them.
So Andrew, what kind of supports do we need to put in place if that's a really huge part of the problem?
Well, I think we need to learn from our lessons in dealing with the tobacco industry in the past, and in particularly in the messages that we give to young people. One of the most successful approaches is to attempt to denormalize the industry itself, to point out that this is an industry which seeks to addict people in order that it can suck large sums of money out of them for the rest of their lives. And teenagers are very conscious of being ripped off. So when we talk about a ripoff to teenagers, that has some resonance. We also know that moving to increase the price of these products is a powerful disincentive, both in terms of smoking and in terms of vaping, which means the public policies which relate to taxation and to stabilization of prices, etc. What's happened is that the price of JUUL has dropped significantly as a consequence of the manufacturer's recognition that that can significantly increase their revenue. I think also we need to begin to understand how we might best help clinically individuals stop vaping. I mean, we have pretty good knowledge of how we can help individuals stop smoking, although we're far from perfect in that respect. And we really don't have good evidence at the moment as to what might be the most effective way to help vapers stop vaping. I suspect it will include pharmacotherapy in association with careful behavioral counseling. But for the younger generation, I think the elimination of the idea that this is normal behavior, denormalizing the industry, getting rid of all that social media advertising is also a very necessary, though far from sufficient step.
Thank you. And final question, because we are at our time, is with cannabis having become legalized in Canada, is cannabis products going to be available for vaping? And what do you anticipate would be the further health complications by vaping cannabis?
Again, another very insightful question. Thank you for that. So in the United States, with the exception of several states, cannabis is illegal. And so much of the cannabis that is smoked is illicit from the black market. And the drug dealers who deal in cannabis dilute or cut their product by adding vitamin E acetate because it has the look and the feel of the cannabis product, but you don't have to have as much cannabis, therefore their profits, go up. In Canada, though cannabis is legal and presumably of known concentration and known quality, it's still the case that a huge proportion of the cannabis market in Canada, and particularly in Ontario, is black market. And so the same kind of drug dealers, et cetera, are involved in distributing these products, and the potential for contamination of cannabis products in this way is very much present there. You know, if you'd asked me that, if you talked about this topic with me 4 or 5 years ago, when we were recognizing that cannabis was becoming legal, our advice would be if you're using cannabis, don't smoke it, vape it. Our advice in 2020, if you've not been a cannabis user, why ever start? If you are a cannabis user, think of using ingestibles. Don't smoke it, don't vape it.
So is cannabis available now by vaping?
Oh, you can. People make their own solutions. Yes, there are cannabis preparations available. Yeah.
Okay, great. No, I think our time's up now. So wanted to thank both of our speakers. Thank you, Max, for your being here and for being so open and honest with us. Thank you, Andrew, for incredible review of the science and what we know. I think there's a huge number of unanswered questions on the way forward and how we can really intervene in a meaningful way. So there's lots more dialogue to happen. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Please complete the evaluation, let us know what you thought, because that helps us plan additional educational events for you. And we just really appreciate everybody taking the time today and being so interested in this topic, because we all have to work together to address it. Thank you all.